Hi there, my name is Michael Cousins, and welcome to another episode of Laker Lessons, brought to you by GVSU. Laker Lessons are virtual learning experiences that cover key topics in K-12 teaching and learning. In this lesson, we're going to dive into the phrase evidence-based to learn what it really means and how educators are connected to it. Helping us tackle that topic is Dr. Vanessa Kiesler, who is an education consultant and an assessment and accountability expert. She was the former deputy superintendent at the MDE and has more than 20 years of K-12 education experience at the state and local levels. Dr. Kiesler, we are so glad to have you here today.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about evidence. And what does evidence-based really mean? Evidence is everywhere, or so we say. Around education circles, you hear the term evidence-based constantly. What's the evidence? What's the evidence-based? What's the research-based? We need to look at the data. We need to look at the evidence. There's this really big belief and focus on evidence-based, but there's a lot more to that term. And so today, we're going to spend some time unpacking this. This session has two parts. The first part is a fairly technical overview of some terms related to evidence, research, data, and information. For those of you who took a methods class when you were an undergrad or in your graduate work, or if you've done any research, some of these terms will be familiar. But don't worry, even if you didn't, it's not going to be as hard as an actual research methods class in graduate school. But just so we are sharing common language, and so you walk away from this session with a few key terms that you can use in future conversations. And then, more importantly, in the second half, I'm going to talk about some practical tips. I know that all of you are educators. You are going to school tomorrow to make decisions, to help students, to support parents and teachers. So while it's really great to talk about the theories of research and evidence and data, you need skills and tools you can put into use. So I wanted to make sure this session included some very tangible, practical tips that you can apply in your work immediately. Let's start with defining some terms. As educators, we love to define terms. It's really a favorite activity, I think, of a lot of people in the education world. But to give us common vocabulary through this session, I did want to spend a little bit of time on a few big terms. And we could do a whole session just on terms around evidence and research and this whole area, but that would be pretty boring, so we won't do that. But we will focus today on a couple keywords that I have here, want to share. So evidence-based versus research-based. I have a confession. In preparing for this session, I actually took a minute to go back and remind myself of the difference because they sound very similar and they're actually very close, but there's a key distinction that is important to us when we are thinking about this idea of evidence. So the term evidence-based means that the intervention or the program, the treatment, whatever you're doing to try to make an impact, was studied scientifically. So that you've used scientific methods, you've used data and analysis, and you're able to produce this evidence, evaluate the intended impact, so that there's been a study and you can see whether the program or the intervention worked or didn't work. And we're going to talk more about that through the session today. Research-based is, again, very close, but slightly different. It means that whatever intervention you're trying to do or program you're thinking about doing has research that suggests it will work, but it can't be conclusively proven. So you haven't done an experiment or something like an experiment to say, this is the actual efficacy, this is the impact. But you do have a whole body of research that suggests that two things are related or that there's an important connection between certain actions and certain outcomes. Much of what we talk about in education actually ends up being research-based because it's challenging sometimes to produce evidence in the traditional sense in an education world. And again, we're going to dig into that some more. Both are really important. Evidence-based is not necessarily better than research-based. They just have a specific application and a term of art here. Data. I'm going to use data today to talk about the raw materials, the building blocks, the pieces of those facts we collect on students, teachers, schools. Something you hear in education circles a lot is, I want to see the data. But what people really mean is they want to see the next word. They want information. They want analysis. The data by itself is just lots of pieces of information in a spreadsheet or a database. Those detailed facts about students or schools. But But to make use of it, so we can use it for policy decisions, we need that data to become actual information. We need to analyze it, we need to work with it. And so when people say, I want to see the data, I think we really need to be asking, well, how do we get information from this data that helps us move forward as educators? So like I talked about on the previous slide, there's this evidence is different than research. What's the big deal about evidence? This really draws on the medical model of research and evidence, which a lot of us are familiar with. And in the past couple of years, we've had a lot of opportunity to hear a lot about efficacy studies and impact and how you estimate all those things. So we've probably, more than in a normal time in the world, have spent some time thinking about medical research and what that looks like. But in a medical model, in general, something is developed, a treatment, a drug, and it's tested using an experiment. And then it either works or it doesn't work, and it moves into the list of treatments or drugs that are available to address any sort of an issue. In the last 30 years, there started to be a great deal more interest in applying that model to education. Can we figure out what works in education? What works and for whom? Can we be sure that if we do this program or we try this strategy that it will work? And I think by work we mean get the outcomes that we want it to get. As a side note, sometimes in education it's hard to agree on what those outcomes are. Are we focused on higher test scores? Are we focused on greater engagement? Are we focused on social emotional learning? So what are the outcomes of interest is sometimes hard to define in education. But the big idea with evidence is whatever outcome you're going toward, maybe we can conduct a bunch of research, we can do experiments like they do in medicine, and we can figure out that this program, this strategy, this intervention will work or won't work, and then we can use it effectively in educational settings. This was certainly helped and pushed along by the advent of big data. Many of you remember No Child Left Behind in the early 2000s. One of many things it brought to us was a lot more data. Assessment data, data on students, teachers, and schools, and then the technology also advanced so that having a lot of data and using a lot of data became more common across not just in education, all areas of society. So we have all this data and we want to know what works. So there's been this push toward evidence in education. I'm sure you've heard this conversation a lot. This, like, what is the evidence? What's the research? So there's 4 types of analyses you might see when you're looking at evidence or when someone's talking about what's the evidence or what's the research. The first one is descriptive analyses. I'm going to go through an overview of these and then dig into each one a little bit more in another slide. So descriptive analyses, you're very familiar with these. You've seen these. They're the basic counts. They're counts of how many students, how many schools, how many teachers. They're often disaggregated or separated out by priority groups. I think sometimes the term disaggregation, people say, well, we need to disaggregate the data, like that's magic. And all it really means is looking at the overall counts of students, let's just take students for this example, as well as understanding the different priority groups, low-income students or students who are English learners, different ways that we can cut the data by student characteristics so we can understand more about who is doing it, how often. Descriptive statistics help you answer those sorts of questions. How many, how much, and what are the differences? They do not let you at all get into evidence. It doesn't tell you if something's working or not working. It just tells you what is. The next type of analysis you might see people do are correlational analyses. So when something's correlated, 2 factors are related in some way, either positively, so as you get more money into education, let's say, you get more higher test scores. Or so that's a positive relationship. Or they can be negatively related, like if you have more behavioral referrals, you get lower test scores, let's say. That's a negative relationship. So as one goes up, the other goes down. Either way, you see these type of analyses pretty frequently. People maybe not call them correlational. You might hear terms here like regressions or ANOVAs or even cross-tabulations with a chi-square statistic. But what correlational analyses really do is say, how much do 2 things relate? How tight are they? And obviously, the thing we're trying to understand is, if we do more of something, will we get more of something else that we want? Another type of analysis you might see in this space is quasi-experimental. And I feel like that's kind of a fancy term that really just means the design of the study approximates or looks like an experiment. So if you can't do an actual experiment, there's all these advanced statistical ways to basically make the data seem like it was part of an experiment. And it helps us get at this type of analysis really does help produce that evidence, because it starts to say what caused what. Did this program, did this treatment actually work in terms of getting the outcome that we wanted? And then the final one, which people are pretty familiar with, although not always in education, is the experimental type of studies or randomized controlled trials. And this is where you have a treatment and you give it to two groups and you see if it worked or not. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So backing up to dig into these a little bit more, descriptive statistics, don't diss them. They're actually really powerful and important. You know, for educators who are faced with decisions, really understanding how many people, how many students, how many whatever is happening, getting that good information is critical. And sometimes it's surprisingly hard. You know, I spent 10 years at the Michigan Department of Education, and we spent a lot of time just trying to understand things like how many teachers are there in Michigan? How many teachers have a certificate in this? How many school counselors? How many schools do we have who offer alternative education programs? All of these types of counts, they're not fancy analyses, but knowing them sometimes was the most important piece of data in the room when we were making a decision. So if you're thinking, man, you know, I gotta really learn how to do a quasi-experimental design or I can never participate in evidence, that's not true at all. Descriptive statistics are a really important part of using data to create information that you can use as an educator to improve your practice and improve your efficacy as an individual educator and as a school. I also like to call them equal opportunity statistics, meaning anybody can do them. In fact, it's a lot of what we teach our kids when in math. So the math standards, the data standards really are about descriptive statistics, you know, creating tables and counts and whatnot. So these are very accessible to many different types of people. You don't have to be a statistician to use descriptive statistics effectively. But they don't give you evidence in the sense of what worked from a causal perspective. Can we conclusively say something about this program or this treatment worked or didn't work? So moving on to those correlational analyses that I talked about, a kind of a nerdy saying that you might hear if you hang around people who love research is correlation does not equal causation. So I'm going to tell you a little story. When I was an undergraduate, I had an opportunity to do education research, and I did these regression analyses where I would look at test scores, let's say, and I would make my regression and I would put it in and I would see that students, lower income students, tended to have lower test scores. And I was like, I have figured it out. Poverty causes low test scores, and I know that from this regression analysis, and I am a genius, and yay. I was right to be excited about the power of data and analytics to help me as an educator, but I was overstating what I learned from that correlational analysis. What I really saw was that as poverty increased, test scores decreased. But that doesn't necessarily mean that poverty alone is the only thing causing those test scores to look like that. And that's important because let's play this out. Let's say that we said, okay, poverty, income. In this case, it was income. Income is the only factor, so if we just increase income, test scores will go up. Well, I imagine it would be effective. What if there's other things acting on that relationship? What if it's not so much about the income, but it's about where your income helps you live and the kind of access to tutoring resources? Or it's about the teachers who teach at your school, or it's about something else. So you have to be careful with correlational analyses that you don't overstate the relationship. It's not causal. Just because something's related doesn't mean it's causal. And I have here on the screen kind of another silly example of this. There is a whole website devoted to funny, spurious correlations that are there but don't actually have any meaning. In this case, it is, you see the red line is the per capita consumption of mozzarella cheese, and the black line is civil engineering doctorates awarded. And you can see that those two things are going up at the same time. So you could conclude, well, as civil engineering doctorates awarded increases, so does consumption of mozzarella cheese, and those things are related. So if we, can increase civil engineering doctorates and we'll get more cheese eaten. Obviously, this is a silly example. Those two things aren't related at all, but they go up together. They're a spurious correlation. So you want to be careful with correlational analyses that you, A, don't overstate that it's telling you about cause, and B, just because two things move together doesn't mean they're necessarily related. So I talked a little bit about randomized controlled trials, but I wanted to just take a minute and really make sure that we all understood what they are. And this is probably pretty familiar to most of you, maybe not in these exact terms, but we do hear a lot about this in the media and kind of common parlance, although usually it's in a medical situation. So randomized controlled trials are experimental, meaning that the study is set up so that it's an experiment. You're going to test to see if this worked or not. In its most simple form, and there is a whole body of study just about how to set up these trials that I will not bore you with, but there are people who devote their whole lives to making sure these trials are set up the right way, and it's very important that they do so that you get the right inferences. But in its most simple form, first you get a sample. So for today, we'll use an example of students. Second, you develop an intervention. In this case, let's say it's a texting system that helps decrease chronic absenteeism. So when a student's absent, they get a text being like, come to school, or whatever, or a text from their favorite teacher being like, missed you today. You want to know, does this actually help reduce chronic absenteeism? You randomly divide that sample of students into two groups, and one group gets the intervention, they get the text when they don't come to school, and the other group doesn't get it. In theory, if the group that receives the intervention, gets the text, lowers their chronic absenteeism, then we can conclude that the intervention worked, that it was effective in lowering chronic absenteeism in those who got it. And if the other group who does not get it, their chronic absenteeism doesn't change, then again, we conclude that the intervention worked and we have evidence that this intervention can help reduce chronic absenteeism. You might be thinking, that sounds really great, but I have a couple questions, and I think that might be hard to do in an education setting, those randomized controlled trials, and you would be right. I think the biggest challenge as we take this medical model of research and move it into education is that it's not as easy to do in an education setting. So one thing to consider, the ethics. If you think you have something, a promising intervention that you think will really help students, only giving it to half of them, there's a lot of ethical considerations about that, right? Is that okay to do? And obviously in medicine that's there too, but there's this whole process of people who volunteer and they know that they might get the placebo, so it's just a little bit of a different situation. And I should say there's a lot of people in the research community who've tried to work on this so that there's ways to set up the study where everybody gets the intervention eventually while preserving the experimental nature of the design. But at its core, there's this question of if you think something works, you want to give it to all kids as quickly as possible. And then these types of studies are very expensive and they take a long time. You need to get kids to participate and give all the data that's needed, be part of the study cohort who aren't even getting the treatment. They take time to set up, they take time to carry out, they're expensive, and as many of you know, education rarely slows down long enough to get evidence. The decisions are usually made in the span of a day or a week or a month, not 3 years from now. In fact, in 3 years, kids might have moved out of the school entirely. So matching the time that it takes to generate this kind of evidence with the speed that policy decisions need to be made is one of the biggest challenges, I think, in this evidence model of education. Another thing to think about is how do you control for contextual factors? So again, in the medical situation, you have this group of people, you're giving them the drug, let's say, and you're controlling for all the other things. This is all that's happening for them. But in a school, even if you try, let's just say for a minute that you as a school agreed that for a year you would do nothing new, you just teach your curriculum, you would just do your normal programming, and you'd add this intervention about chronic absenteeism and texting, so that it's the main new thing. Even if you as a school agreed to that, which seems pretty impossible that you could go a whole year with only working on one thing, right? Even if you agreed to that, there's not a great chance that the state or the federal government wouldn't come in and say, everybody needs to do something different. Everybody needs to add this intervention or this policy. So it's really hard to get the context of the school to settle out so that you can really see that it was that intervention that reduced chronic absenteeism. What if you did that study in a school the chronic absenteeism study. And at the same time, you'd hired 4 new teachers who were great at relationships with kids. And they were, in the meantime, just really building relationships. And so kids were coming because they loved their teacher. None of that's like getting picked up in the data, right? So it's hard in an educational setting sometimes to control for all of that. And then while there are a lot of studies that have managed to do randomized controlled trials, a lot of interventions or strategies in education don't reduce down to a studyable intervention as easily as a pill or a treatment in medicine. There's just a lot of things that are like relationships, a sense of belonging, a sense of challenge, high expectations. These are just some examples of things that are important in education, and we know they're important from research, again, separate from evidence. So research, things like correlational studies that have happened where people say, when we did interviews with kids, we found out that we did surveys and interviews, kids who reported a sense of belonging tended to have higher test scores. We think there's a relationship. That's research. So we know from research, we think relationships matter. But then to like make it into an experiment and say, okay, you 20 kids, you get relationships, like a pill, like here's your relationship, and you 20 don't get it, you can see why it doesn't quite carry over to the randomized controlled trial experiment. The other thing to keep in mind is not all studies are created equal. So I talked about the 4 different types of analyses you might see, but there's a lot of considerations that can make those studies either high quality or less so. And if they're not set up the right way, then it calls their inferences into question. So 2 big things to consider, or that have to be considered when you're looking at evidence. Study design, were there enough people? Did you have the right method? Do you have the right data? And then study implementation. You can have a great plan, but if you don't implement it appropriately, then the inferences, the results you get from the study may not actually be valid. They may be the result of poor design or poor implementation or both. So in this context of, there's been this national interest in more evidence, and the federal government, the federal U.S. Department of Education, has certainly been focusing on evidence-based more and more in the past 30 years. There's a couple things that the U.S. Department of Education has done to try to help with this, because again, everything I just went through is a lot to think about every day when you're trying to figure out, why Johnny didn't bring his pencil to class or whatever. It's kind of, is this a correlational analysis or not? Is not what most of us are thinking about on a day-to-day basis. So one thing that the federal government has done is they created what's known as the What Works Clearinghouse. It was established in 2002 in the Institute for Education Sciences, and its whole point is to look at studies and basically say, hey, this is the kind of evidence they've generated, and also like they're well done or they're not well done, they did a bad job, and to create resources for policymakers. So I bring this up for 2 reasons. 1, I just want you to know it as a resource you might want to tap into. But 2, when we think about this trajectory of evidence and how do we use it, there's the pro of something like the What Works Clearinghouse is that it does summarize this information. It really helps you understand. It tells you where there's evidence and where there's not. But the cons, first of all, it can be a little dense. But secondly, when I go in as an educator and I look, sometimes the thing I'm trying to solve, like I'm trying to solve a lack of engagement in math courses. The strategies or the research that's been able to be done and that is able to meet the standards of evidence of the What Works Clearinghouse, sometimes, again, going back to what I said, sometimes you've had to narrow the focus of the study so much that the application, it leaves you thinking, well, that's helpful if all I was trying to do is pick a math curriculum or figure out how to put a small group together, but I'm trying to address a bigger issue, and it seems like that issue hasn't been studied or hasn't been studied at an appropriate level of evidence. So it's not a perfect solution. The U.S. Department of Education did something with the Every Student Succeeds Act that I think is really important and really beneficial as we move as an educational enterprise toward more evidence. They basically broadened the definition of evidence. So they said there's 4 levels. Strong evidence. You have at least one study that's an experimental study. So if something has strong evidence, you've been able to do an RCT, you can see the impact, strong. Moderate evidence, at least one study that's that quasi-experimental. So where you don't do an actual experiment, but you use statistics to pretend like you did, essentially, to approximate an experiment. promising. At least one study that was a really great correlational study. So like I said, much of education research actually falls in this realm where we do all these things to understand how different things relate to each other. We can't prove that they causally impact one another, but we know that they exist together and that they're important. So the federal government said promising evidence is still evidence, and we need to make room for it as we make good decisions. And then I think most importantly, under evaluation or evidence building level. They opened up this idea that we need to be continually building evidence as educators together. And their technical definition is that it demonstrates rationale based on high quality research or positive evaluation that such activity, strategy, or intervention is likely to improve student outcomes. So again, this would be, you look through all the research and you say, nobody studied this exact thing, or they did study it, but it's all descriptives. But we think, based on what we reviewed and based on our expertise, that we're gonna try this. And then it includes this ongoing efforts to examine the effects. So it allows schools to get in the space of building evidence, creating evidence, and not feeling maybe, what I've seen happen before is the conversation splits. It's like, if we don't have strong evidence, then we just can't do anything. Maybe researchers, a very purist researcher might say, it would be better to do nothing than to do the wrong thing. So you have to have strong evidence before you make a decision about anything in education. Well, obviously any practicing educator is like, well, that's a nice idea, except I have to make decisions because tomorrow I have 500 students entering my building. I have to do something with them. So wouldn't it be better for me to do something that is under evaluation or promising evidence, as opposed to just being like, well, I mean, I think I like this, or I heard on TikTok that this was a good idea. You know, there is a way to be in the middle space where we use data and evidence, even if we don't reach those highest levels of strong evidence. So I'm really glad that this has been introduced into this conversation, because I think in reality, it is hard in education to get evidence that reaches that very highest level. But we should not just say, forget it, let's just do whatever, you know, with no plan and no use of all the data or research that's out there. And then as we've come into the American Rescue Plan, the ARP, the ESSER funds, the federal government has continued this push toward using evidence-based interventions. And so there is this requirement in ESSER that districts use at least 20% of their funds to address lost instructional time using evidence-based interventions. Now, on a practical sense, the Michigan Department of Education is just asking you all to assure that you're doing that. They're not actually asking for a lot of evidence about your evidence-based interventions. But you still should be, it's still good to be thinking about, as we address lost instructional time, what practices are we using, and is there a research base? Is there data to support it? Is there evidence out there? And a number of different organizations have put out resources saying, here are some practices for lost instructional time, like just-in-time tutoring actually has high, strong evidence. They've been able to do, you know, an experimental study and find out that it has good evidence. So do be thinking as you, right now, this is, I guess we're bleeding a little bit into practical tips here, but as you're working with your ESSER funds or your ARP funds right now, you need to be thinking about the evidence base for interventions, particularly around lost instructional time. And with that segue that I gave myself, I'd like to talk now about some practical tips. So what do you do about evidence? You know, I just went through a lot of considerations, a lot of things to think about, but again, school's happening every day. What should I do, and how should I try to leverage evidence and research at the pace of school leadership and your policymaking? First thing is, start with your data. You have data. You should know where your data is, either whether it's on My School Data or your student information system. I know your authorizers have data and support you in that. There's data out there. Your intermediate school district also has data. So if you're sitting here thinking, I don't have any data, you do. Take out your pen and make a note to call either your authorizer, your ISD, or just another leader, school leader, and say, well, where do you get your data from? Or how do you, when you're looking at school data, what do you use? You have data out there. And then remember those descriptives. Even if you're like, I hated statistics, I hated research, I didn't go into education to sit around looking at spreadsheets, descriptives are your friend and you can do it. So you can, in any given question, you're trying to figure out what to do about students arriving late. You've noticed that a lot of students arrive late to school and they miss the first 20 minutes, which is when you do important literacy work. And so all the students who arrive late miss the literacy activation, and then the whole day is kind of downhill from there. So you're thinking, okay, I want to do something about this. Well, what data do you have? Maybe, the tardy data. Find your tardy data. Which students are tardy? What do you know about those students? What do you know about are they economically disadvantaged? Do they live in a certain part of town? Do they take the bus? Do they, think about all the things you know about the students. And then ask, how many students are late and how do they break out by those different priority groups? And then look at the differences. Reflect, and I think this last one's important. Discuss with colleagues. Data doesn't tell you its story on its own. You work with it to get a story from it, and it's best when you work with it with other people. What do you notice? What do you see? What are the differences? What are the similarities? What do you think's happening here? Now I want to take just a little side path for a minute and say, once you've noticed these differences in data, you want to dig in and say why. We always want to do that, like why? Because if we get to the why, then we can try to do something about it. It's often called root cause analysis. But from an equity perspective, I think we need to be really careful sometimes here. So again, in this example, we notice that all these students are arriving late, and when we look at the data by priority groups, we notice it's largely lower income students. So we're like, okay, our low income students, most of the kids who are late are low income. Why do we think that is? If you haven't thought hard about your implicit biases, if you aren't careful about an equity lens, you can reach for reasons that are based in bias, probably unconscious bias, based in what you know to be true about the world and about people that might not actually be true and that might be reproducing disadvantage. So for example, if you say, okay, well, it's mostly our low-income kids who are late. Well, we know that poor parents just really don't care about education. That's probably why they're late. You aren't necessarily being like mean or derogatory. You think you know the truth about something, except that's actually a bias that's been baked in. So you want to be careful when you're doing root cause analysis that you question those biases. This is why also doing it with colleagues and creating that safe space to challenge each other and be like, well, do we actually know that parents don't, low-income parents don't care about education, or is that just something you believe based on your own background or your own biases that we all bring to the table? There are some tools to help with this. The Fishbone Protocol, the 5 Whys, those are 2 that are offered through MyKIP, the Michigan's Integrated Continuous Improvement Process, which I'll talk about more at the end of this presentation. But I wanted to point you at another tool that might be useful when you're having these conversations. So I think the other thing with root cause analysis is to get away from kid-based or people-based reasons, this kid doesn't care or doesn't whatever, and think more about policies, processes, and practices that are supporting or impeding those students. So students aren't late because of some intrinsic lack at the kid level. They're probably late because of some structural issue in society or in education. And so this policy analysis tool put out by the Great Lakes Equity Center helps you talk through your policies. It asks you to think about, so again, late arrival. Let's say we notice all these kids and we notice that there is a rule that you can't come to school without having completed a COVID screener and without a certain number of school supplies. You have to have all your school supplies, let's just say. You might want to think through your policies, right? So what's the intent of this policy? What are we trying to do with the policy of have all your materials? The intent is everybody's prepared for school. We come in ready to learn. What are the social constructions? Well, that people can just all be ready as easily, or that this is something that's accessible to everyone. Who benefits from this way? Well, kids who find it easier to be prepared for school for a large variety of reasons, right? And then what actions will redress the inequities we see in our policy? And that's the hardest part. Once you've talked through the policy and you realize, we put this policy in for a really good intention. We really had a good reason. But when we look at it, it's acting inequitably on our students. It's disadvantaging some in a way that we didn't intend. So what can we do to help fix it? Do we change the policy, or do we change the supports around the policy? So again, root cause analysis with your data is critically important, but making sure to keep those equity lenses on, thinking about your implicit biases, and really diving into what what the policy is and how it is intentionally or not creating disadvantage for certain students is really important, so that you arrive at solutions that not only help some students, but help all of your students. Okay, going back to your data. So you've looked at your data, you've done root cause analysis, you've been very equity focused, you see some things, triangulate your data. Don't just look at one source. So don't just say, oh, well, I've got this test score, and so that's what I need to know. Again, many of you do this, I think, in your data dialogues that you do as teams, you do it as teachers. We know in our heads that one piece of data isn't enough, but in practice, sometimes we're not sure what else to do. So are there other sources of quantitative data? You know, you can look at test scores or attendance, behavior, enrollment numbers, graduation rates. But there's a lot of different types of qualitative data too. So notes from teachers, administrators, you know, what are people saying? Feedback from students. I think sometimes when we talk about data analysis, we discount just simply pulling aside 5 students and saying, I noticed, you know, hey, like in a private, again with this is the late arrival, in a private setting, I noticed you're late for school sometimes. Is there anything I can do to help you get to school on time? Or, you know, what goes on for you in the morning that we could help you get here? What could be better? That's a really important source of data to help you understand what's going on. You can look at student work. That's another form of qualitative data. And again, discussions with colleagues. What you all see as experts, as educators, is important information in the discussion. It's a cliche, but I think it really does apply here. Not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. We're never going to have perfect data. To perfectly capture everything about the human experience into data form is impossible, and even if it were possible, it takes so much time and money and effort that by the time we got done, we wouldn't have any energy left to actually analyze it for information anyway. So don't worry if you can't get every student to give you feedback or every note from every teacher. Do be okay with getting some data and using it in concert with other data when you're thinking about making decisions. On to another thing that happens. I've been in a lot of education circles, and people love to say, well, show me the research. Where do you have the research on that? Show me the data. I want to see your research. And you're left thinking, okay, we all want to use research, we want to use evidence, we want to use data. Well, how do you find the good stuff? And that's a technical term, the good stuff in research. Good research that meets those standards. My first bullet recommendation is a little bit pie in the sky, but I wish we would do it. When somebody says this, I wish we could set group norms and say, well, what do we all agree counts as research? Have you ever been in a situation where it's like a showdown, like a shoot 'em out showdown, where everybody's pulling out their research and being like, mine says this and mine says that, but the quality differs, the types of studies. One person has just a descriptive report and somebody else has a correlational report. People don't think about that, again, for good reason. They're focused on what they want to have happen. But if we're really going to talk research and evidence, then we need to agree on what we mean as research and evidence. We can't just all throw those terms around and say, well, I have evidence when I'm holding a descriptive report. So try to set some norms, like what counts as research? Maybe you might use this PowerPoint and sit down and say, well, let's use these terms. What are we talking about here? Are we looking at data and information? Are we looking at research? Or are we actually talking evidence, like evidence from experimental studies? So beyond that, if you are tasked with bringing forward some research, peer-reviewed journals, these are the education journals where academics publish. And this is a whole enterprise in academia where people spend lots of years writing and they submit to these journals and they get reviewed by their peers and they get revised and resubmit, and this goes on for a while. But the point of this enterprise is that the scientific community, whatever gets published, has met a quality standard, is the idea. The Education Resources Information Center, and I have the link there, ERIC, is the place where all of that is indexed. This is very dense. I don't know that you want to spend all your time there, but if you ever are like, wow, I really want to find peer-reviewed journals, I really want to find that high-quality research on a topic, ERIC is your best quick way to do it. Go to ERIC instead of Googling when you're looking for something like a peer-reviewed journal. The other thing is to avoid white papers or other research produced by companies about their products. I think we can all see the challenge there, right? So any given company, company's got a new social emotional learning curriculum and they say, well, we have great research that shows how great this works. They may have done really nice research, but there's clearly a conflict of interest between somebody trying to tell you something and then say, we have, produced this fair and unbiased study that proves that it's amazing. Some companies do partner with researchers externally and get actual independent evaluation of their products, but that is not as common. So in general, go back to that triangulate. If a company is like, here's our research, be like, that's great. Can you give me like 2 peer-reviewed articles that didn't come from your company that validate this? Or can you point me at some other evidence that backs up what you're saying? Also be careful with research from advocacy groups. So there's a number of advocacy groups in education who support all kinds of things. And what they're great for is they give voice to particular viewpoints, ways of approaching education, and many of us affiliate with them at different points based on what we want to advocate for. And many of them produce data and research. Again, the conflict of interest can be clear. They don't want everybody to just evaluate the evidence or the information in an unbiased way and arrive at their own conclusions. They want people to believe in what they're advocating for. So you have to be careful. There's just a motive behind that research that you may not want to use when you yourself are trying to find unbiased information. Always validate against other sources if you can. Again, I already said with the company, they might actually have done a nice study, but if you can't find it replicated or something, or what they find, you can't find any evidence for it anywhere else, I would really be suspect of that information. Use Google judiciously. I almost put in this presentation, don't Google, but I was busy Googling while I was doing the presentation, so I was like, well, that's not exactly real for us. But Googling like what works in terms of helping students get better at math is not your most effective way to use Google when you're trying to find good research. Go to some of the places I pointed out. I'm going to point out a couple others, and then maybe use Google to help enhance your search. But if you Google those types of questions, you will get, the first things you'll get are companies and advocacy organizations. That's what comes up really quickly. And then last but not least, the smell test. When you're looking at a paper and you're thinking, okay, Vanessa said a whole bunch of stuff that one day about correlations and quasis and something, I don't know. But if you're looking at a paper and it's got those tables and descriptive data, it's counts of things. And then there's words like, we know the evidence proves that this causes this, or the effect of this is that, or there's efficacy, and you don't see any methods or experimental design or words like regression or selection bias, they're overstating their conclusions based on the data. You can look at the data could be good, but be cautious of conclusions that jump too far beyond what you have. And yeah, like I said, if there's a discussion of we know this works, then there should be a discussion of methods. You don't probably need to spend tons of time parsing out their methods. I think that's what things like What Works Clearinghouse are for. But if there's no discussion of methods and they just say, we know it works, well, then I'd be like, well, how do you know? Because what I learned from that one seminar I listened to is that to have actual evidence, you need to do some sort of experiment or some sort of design that produces evidence. And if you can't tell me your methods, then I'm wondering where your conclusions came from. There are resources that you can reach out to help you. You need to know what the best research is on something. You are probably located somewhere near a college of education, or if not, you graduated from one at some point or were affiliated with one. Call somebody, call a former professor, pick up the phone and call the department head, or just call somebody. Colleges are full of people who spend their whole day thinking about research and evidence, and they would love to answer your question. They might, if you ask them about something they really love, you might get an earful, which is a lot more than you wanted. Like if you just want to know, hey, I'm wondering what some good reading recovery programs are, you might get a dissertation in response. But you will get good information. They'll be able to point you at a couple key articles or key research, or say, here's some resources that I would refer you to. Again, your ISD and your authorizer both have people who could help. And if they themselves don't hire people, they probably know people. So don't be afraid to call and say, I'm trying to make a really good research-informed decision. I'm trying to make an evidence-based decision. And I'm trying to figure out where the research is. Or my board or somebody has asked me to bring forward research on this topic, and I'd love some thought partnership in getting together that research. All of these people, including the Grand Valley Charter Schools office, could help you think through that. So don't suffer alone. Pick up the phone, or probably, a chatting app or something. We don't call each other a lot, but call somebody and say, I need some help getting to this. I already mentioned the What Works Clearinghouse, and that's the website for that. But there's also the regional educational laboratories have something called Ask a Rel. And so these labs are regional labs around the country. The whole point is that they do education research and then they produce policy-friendly briefs. And Ask a Rel is where somebody wrote in and said, what are good strategies for after-school tutoring? So they answer these questions for people, but they also archive every Ask a Rel they've ever done. So they're arranged topically. You can go there, click on literacy or after school or whatever, and you'll see a short summary of what the different research says, and then links to the actual studies if you wanted to read them yourself. I usually don't. I'm usually good with the summary. But, maybe you get into a rabbit hole, do a real deep dive, and it's a good opportunity for that. And then the MyKIP Strategy Bank can help with good research. So that's just a teaser. We'll talk more about MyKIP at the end. At the end of the day, when it's all said and done, use your common sense. Many things in education are just hard to study accurately. So you need to do your best to turn data into information and then that information into smart decisions. But don't get caught in that where is the research trap. And also, sometimes people say, well, where is the research? When what they really mean is, I don't like your idea and I don't want to do it. Which is also an okay thing to say, but we're either talking about what's the research, what's the evidence, what's the data, or we're talking about our opinions on what we should do. And I think just trying to get clear on that, and don't follow one trail when really people are saying, I don't want to do that, but I'm going to do a smoke screen of what's the data, what's the research, what's the evidence, when really I don't want to do it because I don't agree. And then use the tools at your disposal, and one of your best tools is your experience as an educator. So you have your data and you have your information. You have research and evidence that has been done by independent researchers. We talked about where that is. And then you have your expertise as an educator. And in that triangle are these smart decisions for students. So use all those things together and don't discount your expertise as an educator. That's going to have to come into play when we're talking about education. There is not a magic place where we can go and find the answer that will make education work. It is much more complicated than that, because education is much more complicated than that. And I just said there is no answer, but there is one answer, and that is MyKIP. MyKIP is the answer specifically to helping you with some of these pieces around data and evidence. So hopefully by now you've all gotten into MyKIP, you've started being trained on it through the different resources from the department or your ISD or your authorizer, whoever is helping you be trained on it. But as you know, a component of MyKIP is the Assess Needs component. And these are, I have listed there the different parts of Assess Needs. So what's your area of inquiry, and then what's your data discovery. So MyKIP is going to help you have data together so you can look at it. You don't have to necessarily go make it yourself. And then looking at your initiative inventory, and then a gap. So, here's what we see in our data, here's what we're already doing, and here's what's not working. It also includes that root cause analysis that we talked about. So MyKIP creates this opportunity for you to look at your data and do a root cause analysis. And then as you make your plan, you're going to write those measurable goals. You're going to write end and interim targets. And you're going to select strategies from a strategy bank. And in that strategy bank, strategies are loaded keyed to one of the 4 ESSA evidence levels. So is it strong, moderate, or emerging? Is it that promising practices, coming up the lowest level, but still important? It's all in there in the strategy bank. So you don't necessarily even have to go digging around in What Works Clearinghouse or the RELs or wherever. You can go to the strategy bank and see strategies and see their level of evidence and evaluate that. I know the department has been working to move strategies over from the What Works Clearinghouse. I know the ISDs are working on some of that too. So anyway, you have an opportunity here in Michigan to have a platform that helps you integrate data, evidence-based strategies, and then it includes this ongoing evaluation component. So you're always, those measurable goals and targets, you're always saying, okay, we're gonna do this, and we think it's gonna lead to this, and it either did lead to it or it didn't, and let's reevaluate. So you're building that evidence for yourself on a daily basis in a way that's meaningful to your own context. So it's really an exciting opportunity to be able to get into this evidence-based work that we've been talking about today, but not just on your own. You have a mindset, a process, and a platform to help you do it. And if you're not familiar with MyKIP, I'm sure you have gotten communications from the Michigan Department of Education on it, but definitely look it up on the MDE website and make sure that you know and that you are using it to your fullest advantage, not just to do your plans, but to really help you become that evidence-based educator that you want to be. So my final tips: be confident. You can both consume and generate evidence. This isn't just something for people who work at Grand Valley in the academic departments. You can do it too. You are doing it, actually, might not even notice it sometimes. Always be honest about what the data and the research say. If you try something and it's not working, it's not working. That's okay. Even in medical research, there are plenty of things that people try and the finding is it didn't work, and then we don't use it. So that is helpful to know. And then really finding that balance between use that data, research, and evidence to inform your decisions, but don't get caught in that, well, we can't do anything because we don't have perfect evidence. And trust what you know, your educator expertise, and know that that matters a lot as well. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I really appreciate spending time together, and good luck on your evidence journey.